But on to our program this evening. And I want to say that this man has got a very unusual background, as I said. He is, first of all, a graduate of Notre Dame. For anybody who knows Father Ted Hesburgh, it was God, country, Notre Dame. And Tim might echo that as well. He might, but having had a family, and Father Hesburgh did not, I'm not sure what order, but family would probably be right under God, probably God, family, country, and Notre Dame, or whatever the order. But a rather unusual background, which you'll address a little bit about, having had the opportunity to be one of the three co-equal branches of government of Congress, power of the purse and the power to make legislation, to being an ambassador, not one of the three co-equal branches of government, but very much representing who we are in a country which is one of the largest, if not the largest democracy in the world with over 1 billion people. So India is in a unique situation, and we're going to be starting with that question. But first, Ambassador, will you spend a bit of time? I'll tell a quick story. When I first met Tim, it's been a few decades ago, and none of us have changed a bit in this past period of time. And I was toying the idea of running for Congress, and people said, well, go out to Washington and meet with some of your Indiana representatives in your party. And Tim was one of the people I met with. And we had a really great discussion. It was really wonderful. He had some very, very good advice. And as he was leaving the door to run across the street from his office and cast a vote, he turned around and said to me, now, Betty, if you decide to do this, you do not abandon your children. Don't abandon your family. You've got to remember to spend time with your children and spend quality time. And that quality time cannot be parades. And I said to him, well, I wonder why my children, they're now full grown, hate parades to this day. So, and Tim will probably know a lot about that. So with that, Ambassador Roemer, will you please tell us a little bit about what we further need to know about you before we dive into our questions? And what
Well,
you like
Betty,
to talk about?
Thank you again for that very, very gracious introduction and the warm personal story about you contemplating running for Congress. And it makes me feel, like I missed those parades because I didn't ride in a car. I didn't, walk the middle of the street. I plunged into the crowds in those parades and talked to people. And I miss some of that, not being, in Congress anymore, that direct contact with people and them telling you exactly what they thought and what should happen when I get back to Washington, D.C. from LaPorte or South Bend. So great story. It brings back wonderful memories for me. Thank you again, Betty, for all the prep that you've done and setting up this great decisions opportunity. I am very honored to be part of this with your turnout of educated and informed and very interested people that are turning their cameras on, and I can actually see them. If I were all you, I'd have my slippers on and my t-shirts and my dog next to me, and I'd be relaxed and taking it easy tonight and hopefully enjoying the conversation, and hopefully I can get to your questions toward the end of the program. Ray, I want to thank you as well, too. Thank you very much for your distinguished service at Ball State University, teaching American business. Great contributions you've made as well. And now both Betty and Ray are working on trying to make sure that foreign policy stays alive and well in the minds of Hoosiers and people around the country. It's such an important topic. And it's one that the American people must pay attention to because tax dollars are involved. Our sons and daughters go overseas to serve our country. That's the treasure that we never get back. And we've got a lot at stake in the volatile, turbulent world that is out there, from transnational threats like terrorism, biological weapons, and now drones, to climate change and hunger and Al Qaeda growing back in the Sahel across Africa. So a lot of things for us to be aware of and involved in. And it's so great, Ray and Betty, that you guys provide this opportunity for speakers to come directly into people's living rooms and talk and listen and share opinions about what this means for the United States of America going forward. Let me just share a couple thoughts about U.S.-India relations in a very general sense. Many of you will know what I'm going to talk about, but I'm going to put it in some kind of perspective because it's important for the challenges that we face today with India and in the region they live in. And then Betty will fire a bunch of questions at me for 45 minutes or so, and then I can get to your very important and relevant questions as well. So first of all, in terms of the history of the U.S.-India relationship, when the U.S. and the Soviet Union were battling for power as the two superpowers after World War II, we didn't have a relationship, very, very strangely, with India. Here's another democracy, a huge growing democracy with a lot of poor people in it, natural values with the United States. But the United States at that time had decided to partner with Pakistan. India determined to partner with the Soviet Union. And we did virtually zero defense trade. We did very little economic trade. We would send professors back and forth between our two countries on wheat and food, and we sent foundations back and forth to try to help on some of the healthcare and education problems. But there was not much engagement. Fast forward to President Clinton and nuclear testing by India, which was a very tense period. And we started to try to think of India back in the Clinton era as an emerging global power that was right next to China and Russia, a very important part of the world in the Indo-Pacific with the Blue Ocean there, and right on the verge of the Middle East and Africa, that we must have better relations with for our security, for our geopolitical interests, and for our strategic interests in the world. So Clinton recognized this and started a relationship with India that then blossomed under President Bush, George W. Bush, with the civilian nuclear agreement. President Obama, when he recruited me to be ambassador, said to me, Tim, my foreign policy is going to pivot to Asia. We are going to spend a lot of time and attention economically to try to grow middle-class jobs in America by exporting product to India, having them buy it, and having them send the money back to America to keep manufacturing things in places like Indiana for jobs and for growth. India can be a balance to China, the president told me. We need you there to help us grow this relationship and balance the power around the world that we're seeing shifting. And not only do we need to be close to India, the president said to me at the White House before I took my first trip to Delhi to be ambassador, he said to me, imagine if India partners with Russia and China and how that axis in the world would isolate America and make our job all the tougher to be a coalition builder, a altruistic power, a military power. If India decides to go a different way from America, we have a much tougher strategic battle on our hands with a trifecta of Russia, China, and India together. So we had our first state dinner at the White House was for India and Manmohan Singh, the prime minister, the longest trip that President Obama took in the history of his 8 years in office was to see us in India and spend 4.5 days with the Indian people. And we riveted the interagency process in Washington. CIA, FBI, State Department, USAID, Energy, Commerce, USTR. We all started working closely together to come up with historic new agreements to build trust and confidence between India and the United States. We moved them up to from the 25th largest trading partner of the United States to the 12th largest trading partner. We signed brand new homeland security arrangements with India, new agreements on intelligence sharing, which were critical to the Indo-Pacific, and brand new defense sales to India, which meant American jobs and Indian security against China. a win-win proposition. You fast forward through the Trump and the Biden administration, and this is a bipartisan commitment on the part of America. Democratic and Republican presidents are all in to deepening and broadening the U.S.-India relationship. And we can talk about this more, Betty, in the Q&A period. In India, very interestingly, there is also bipartisan support for this relationship, both with the BJP party, which is the controlling party today, which Mr. Modi, the prime minister, is in charge of the BJP, and the Congress Party, the historically long-serving party, the traditional party going back to the days of Nehru. They are very pro-American as well. So the political system supports this relationship, which is absolutely fundamentally important to us getting things done through our political system to keep this relationship going in a positive, strategic, productive way, and not let the irritants and the tension in the relationship derail this very, very important bilateral relationship. We have irritants in it. We can talk more about that. You have to manage these things, whether it's the Russians and selling very inexpensive oil to India, whether it is China going across the border into India, as they did a few years ago, and killing 19 soldiers, which can create a war type of situation. Whether it is trade, the United States needs more access to the Indian market to make sure that we have the same kind of access that India has to our market. These are tensions and irritants that take constant managing to keep the overall relationship going in the right direction. And last point, Betty, and this is a key one, and I just will underscore it and emphasize it and put an exclamation mark by it. And all your viewers know this well, but it's so important to understand this, is the United States and citizens, whether you live in Carmel, Indiana, or whether you live in Sacramento, California, we wake up every day and we have two broad oceans to protect us, the Atlantic and the Pacific. We have Canada and Mexico, pretty friendly neighbors for the most part, except maybe on some tariff issues. Very, very friendly neighborhood. And so our national security advisor to the president and our president wake up most mornings, they're not too worried about national security in our neighborhood. Now wake up in New Delhi. You have Pakistan on your border, where you've had 3-4 wars in the past several decades. Arch enemy number one over the past 4 or 5 decades. You have China, which is more of a trading partner, but a threat to India, where the 62 war broke out, which had devastating impact on the Indian military. And the recent border incursion that I just mentioned that had tensions sky high between China and India. You have Iran. You have the battle over the last several decades in Afghanistan. And you have Central Asia, with some of its instability and issues. And you have about 63% of world trade now going through the Malacca Straits through the Indo-Pacific Ocean. So a key area of the world where the prime minister and the national security advisor in New Delhi wake up on pins and needles most days, trying to manage their neighborhood, rather than what the United States national security advisor and president wake up to most mornings.
You have opened up a whole, you and I had talked earlier this afternoon about what questions we should ask. You have effectively added 10 more to the list. I'm not sure we can do this in 45 minutes. So I hope all of you are out there taking notes because you have a chance to ask questions. By the way, I want to say very, very briefly, thank you for the compliment to Ray and I. We work with a large board. I want you all to know that our programs are brought to you by not a large board, but a wonderful board that does this. We're all volunteers. We don't have a paid staff. We have an intern. So thank you for the compliment, but it's shared among some wonderful, wonderful volunteers for the Indiana Council of World Affairs. India, we talked about this. They're in a difficult neighborhood, and they've been a difficult neighbor themselves in the past. And it is the largest democracy. Modi is he's not acting any differently than other democracies in a civil society that we see in Europe, becoming more nationalistic. Um, does this? Do you see a threat to any of this with his national style as a democratic leader? Because I suppose I can ask this. We're seeing this across Europe. This might be me, but there's been many articles addressing this. They're a huge trading partner, largest democracy. Is his nationalist leanings fueling any threats to continuing as a democratic leader in a democracy?
Well, it's a very interesting and provocative question, Betty, and let me answer it briefly because it brings up so many other questions, but broadly as well too. So first of all, we see around the world, whether we talk about Italy, whether we talk about Great Britain, whether we talk about France, whether we talk about the recent election in Germany over the weekend, whether we talk about India or South America, we are seeing populism and nationalism rise everywhere. We're seeing people throw incumbents out and want change. And we're seeing right of center governments come into power. So that's not particular to the United States or India as the oldest and the biggest democracy in the world. That's a worldwide trend. And in my opinion, and part of the challenge for democracy today is that they need to be able to show their voters and their citizens that democracy, i.e., government and government programs, whether it be a Head Start program for youth, whether it be a forestry service program to put out fires in the West, whether it be affordability of college education, which is getting out of hand for a lot of people, whether it be, government action to control the price of eggs that have gone up 4 times their price in the last couple months. Government has to show its voters and citizens that it can impact their daily life and help them. And many times in these elections taking place around the world, people are frustrated, they're angry, and they want to see some change and result in their life. And in India, the challenges are profound. You have big divisions between the wealthiest people and the poorest people. You still have probably somewhere between 400 and 500 million people living below a poverty line. Even the middle class, broadly defined, makes per capita maybe somewhere in the $10,000 to $15,000 range per year, whereas our middle class in America is somewhere in the $58,000 to $65,000 range. So even the middle class in India has challenges economically. And so they see Mr. Modi coming in, they're not so concerned about democracy in the terms of freedom and access to voting and paper ballots, and they want a government that will help them get jobs, that will help deliver economic progress for the country. And they see Modi as a business leader to do that, and that's their primary concern. So very interesting to see that. The United States continues, as in my role when I was there, to dialogue with India on human rights, on democracy. And I've always found the best way to do that is not lecture the government that you're living in, not try to do big public events castigating them, but to say to them, look, we are two great democracies. We both make mistakes. We both are going through very challenging times. How do we both learn from each other to put guardrails around our system so that we continue to have uh, systems where the people, of the people, by the people, for the people, run the government and run it through elections? And last point, Betty, while there are issues and challenges in India today on democracy, on the rights of Muslims, on freedom of religion, they just went through an election, and close to 800 million people voted. It took 7 weeks to run the election, and there wasn't much of any kind of complaint about illegal voting, no problems. The people accepted the results as we did in America in the 24 election. We did not do that in 2020, but we did it in 24. So these two great democracies have come through their most recent elections with successful elections by the standards of they were accepted, they were, approved in the in the federal legislative process, with the electoral count in the United States being read in Congress, and there weren't, accusations of fraud and corruption.
We talked also about this earlier. Almost 2/3 of India's population is under 65. And 65 to a young person is old, not just pretty old, it's just old. A vast number of India's population, they're young people.
Yeah.
I think you can give us the percentage. We may have mentioned it earlier. I think I shared with you when I talk about this with my students at Purdue in global studies, they see English as an imperial language started by the Brits and all that, where the students overseas want to learn English so they compete in a global world. And tell us, well, first of all, what is that statistic for India's young population? But what do they want? What do they want politically? And what do they want in addition to jobs economically? What do they want a relationship with the West? Or do they want a relationship with just anyone where there's a job, which would include China or Russia? Because they're the future. And where are they with Modi?
Yeah, so a number of good questions to dissect from that. First of all, the demographics. If you look at, let's all imagine a pyramid, and the demographics in China are, the pyramid looks like this upside down.
Yeah.
The demographics in China are very, very few young people being born and coming up through the system. And the majority of people are over 50 and therefore supporting through their social security schemes, their healthcare system and everything gets more and more and more difficult in China. Whereas in India, the pyramid is the opposite way. We have in India, we've seen about somewhere in the vicinity of, I would say, this is a guess. I'd probably estimate that 45% of the population is 35 and younger. So their demographics are absolutely supportive of this society in terms of supporting older people, vulnerable people, projecting very healthy GDP growth in the future. India is, I believe, now the 5th largest economy in the world, projected to be the 3rd largest economy in the world in the next, 5 to 6 years. They might be the 2nd biggest economy in the world to the United States in the next 40 or 50 years and overtake China. So they are growing, and that demographic growth of young people is really propelling a lot of that. Now, the danger of that, and I mentioned this to you earlier, Betty, is when you have that number of young people coming through the system, being born, coming through elementary and secondary school, coming out of college, coming out of engineering and doctor and PhDs and law degrees, there is a huge pressure on the political system to create jobs for those people. And if you don't, you better have some safety valves to to release some pressure, because those people are not going to be happy being unemployed and highly educated. So Modi's got this balancing act where he's got to create jobs in that economy. They're growing at about 6.5% per year in India right now. The US comparatively is a little over 2%. India is growing faster than China right now. Whether they can keep that growth up will be very, very dependent upon employing those younger people at a steady pace. And so Modi's got a very significant challenge doing that. And what do young people think of Modi? I think a lot of them like him. There's a corruption problem in India. Everything written about India and Modi, whether you're on one side or the other, he is an incorruptible guy. He's almost like a monk. He's not married. He says his entire life and job is devoted to honesty and the security of the Indian people. So he's got this brand in India that is, pretty Teflon coated, and young people like it because he's honest and non-corruptible, and he's business oriented, and he wants to keep this economy growing. And so far, under his first 2 terms, he has kept that economy going in a positive direction.
Is a term 4 years each?
Yes.
So are there term limits in India?
No.
So he could go on for quite a while.
Yes. And in India, they have a lot of politicians that are in their 70s and 80s, and there is no age limit. There is no term limit. Their system, as all you know, is a republic, a federal republic system, much like ours. Their states have chief ministers, which are like our governors, and they have a Lok Sabha and a Raj Sabha, a lower chamber of their federal Congress, and an upper chamber, their Senate, is the Raj Sabha. And those people are elected for different year terms, just like ours are, 2 and 6. So it's a very similar system to the United States system.
And these are elections which, in your view, since there are no term limits, he could get reelected through pretty much fair elections.
Yes, so far, if he wanted to, Betty. Now, speculation is that he may not run the next term. He was just reelected. He had to form a coalition government this time. They were projecting that he was going to win overwhelmingly without any need to form, a combination or coalition government in their parliament. He did. There's been no danger to the cracking of his coalition. He's run it pretty effortlessly and smoothly and effectively so far, but he's not in quite as strong position this time politically in the parliament as he was in his first 2 terms.
Let's go back to that neighborhood that India lives in, because those are very interesting borders. And you talked about how India has made its huge advancements through trade and its relationship with the West. And how sustainable is India's balancing act between strategic competition and economic interdependence with China? But to what extent does India's historical border disputes with China and with others shape its current foreign policy choices? That takes us back to the title. Where do they, not so much where they lean, but they have to please a lot of neighbors, and they also want to stay economically strong and grow.
And grow. and grow. And that's their mantra is to make in India. In America, we hear a lot about make America great. In India, it's make in America. And in India, that means manufacture in India. They don't want to particularly open their markets to our agricultural products or our manufactured products. We had intense, month-long negotiations with the Indians to break open some of their barriers and get access, free access, fair access for our products. But with Modi's pressure to create jobs in India, he doesn't necessarily want to just bring in completely manufactured finished products. He wants to create jobs by manufacturing a lot of those products. So it's smart of the United States to, as Obama did. I think I'll try to be bipartisan here, as Trump is trying to do with tariffs on India in particular. We can talk about generally tariffs, but in India in particular, there's got to be a wedge and leverage to say to the Indians, look, you're going to have a $45 billion trade surplus with us. Some of that is all right, but all of it is not. And we get jobs in America by manufacturing GE turbo jet engines and selling them around the world, and you're going to buy some. And we make jobs in America by building the great C-17 aircraft that can be a military aircraft or a disaster relief aircraft. We have 8,000 jobs in America as a result of building that C-17. You're going to buy some of those. That's a win-win proposition for you. So, I think, that access for the United States as a reliable security partner for India is a fair one for us to negotiate. On the other hand, you've mentioned the word non-aligned several times, Betty. The Indians hate the word alignment. They prefer partner. We'll partner with you, but we're not aligned with anybody, they'll say, because they interpret the word alignment as being of permanency, of alignment on a host of different issues. When India wants to be able to pick one issue, maybe to partner with, it might be on, it might be on digital trade. It might be an agreement on underwater sea cables. It might be an agreement on buying drones from the United States. India recently bought about $3 billion worth of Reaper drones for their defense purposes. That's a significant buy on the defense side, and again creates jobs in America. But on the India side, we have to be able to try to work through, how do we maintain a strategic relationship with India, with their threats from China, Pakistan, other parts of the world, and try to make them secure, safe from the history of when we partnered with Pakistan and they partnered with the Soviet Union. We're still building trust through some of that mistrust that was decades long. And India also, in this chaotic world that we live in today, it's not the superpower relationship with clean lines between nation states. We have a very, very disrupted and splintered world today. And India plays that very strategically. When can they buy oil from Russia and not get sanctioned? When can they do trade with China and not pay a price for it? When can they buy military weapons from the United States and bolster their security? They're going to go around the world and see who they can partner with on what types of issues to benefit their growth and their security. And in this splintered world, they don't need to partner every time with anybody. they can say something positive about the United States or Russia or China one day and then criticize them the next. And they can get away with it in the kind of world that we live in.
Did you see some significance? I think, wasn't Modi maybe the first person to come as the head of state to the White House? Do you see some significance in that being the first head of state to visit with Trump as the new president?
Yes, I mean it's very significant. Just as President Obama had the first state dinner for India, President Trump is sending a very clear signal around the world to Xi and China, to Europe on the NATO issue, to other partners and enemies, that India is a strategic partner and a reliable partner for the United States. And we are going to keep them, the Indian, people, in our orbit of partnership, coalition building, whether that is one coalition of countries, um, ASEAN countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, where we can form a coalition of like-minded countries and talk about fishing rights and energy access and education and economic development issues. But then India says, okay, I'll partner with the United States on that one. But then China comes to them and says, well, we've got a new agreement, India, that we'd like to up our trade with you. We want to buy a lot of food from you because the United States may sanction us on food, given the Uyghur situation and forced labor. So we're going to go someplace else and get our wheat and our corn and our soybeans. And so India becomes a supply chain in this new world for China. And India is going to play those cards smartly, strategically, geopolitically, and that's what the United States does too. That's what we're doing around the world. We're picking and choosing partners. We're building different coalitions. We're trying to pick off different countries, whether it comes to the Middle East or climate change and Ukraine.
I'd like to ask a question about BRICS. And our audience may know about this is BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and now South Africa. That was just recently added, I believe. And just a history in the first and second industrial revolutions of the 19th century, that was only the United States, England, and parts of Europe. It left out Latin America, China, Africa, Asia. And the countries that participated in those first two revolutions, industrial revolutions, got rich. And the rest of the world got poorer. And the gap has increased over time. Is BRICS kind of an answer there? I'm not sure that we're in a third industrial revolution, but certainly technology would have you. India is strong. This is where we're going. And is this an answer to being left out the first time? It's kind of maybe much deeper than that. But where is BRICS in this relationship with its answer to, and is India the leading powerhouse of BRICS? Where is this going? Are they the leader? Is India the leader of the global South? Are they the leader of BRICS? And is BRICS sort of the answer? If you left us out the first time, but boy, you guys need us.
Well, I read your piece in Great Decisions by Dr. Leslie Vijamuri, and it was a very, very comprehensive, well-written, well-researched piece. If I had any kind of addition to it or edit to it, she often refers to India as an emerging power. I would say they are an emerged power. They are a powerhouse on the global stage. And one of the reasons to your question, Betty, is they play a very prominent role in BRICS. You mentioned the countries that comprise BRICS, but there are more. Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, several other countries are part of that organization. And India uses that organization as a platform to elevate issues and support for issues where maybe the US and France and Germany and Japan don't have that developing country issue at the top of their agenda. We are developed countries. We have gone through a lot of the development stages. India is still developing. They still have hundreds of millions of people in poverty. They still have 60% of their workforce working in agricultural areas, not in manufacturing. They still have um, all kinds of challenges with technology and lighting up rural communities and connecting rural communities to the internet. So they are developing, and they use these organizations, not just BRICS, but organizations like the G20, organizations like the Global South, to elevate their power so that when they meet with the US and China and Russia and European and other powers, they can say, we don't just feel this way. You should be coming in our direction, United States or Europe or China or whoever they're talking to, because this other entity, this multilateral organization, 9/10 of us in the organization feel the same way about this issue. So you need to come our way. We don't need to go your way. And India is very good at trying to leverage that power within these different organizations to promote their agenda, whatever that agenda might be, a developing nations agenda, money for financing climate change. The list goes on and on and on. And quite frankly, the United States is very supportive of India playing a prominent role in these organizations. In fact, when India was the president, they were the chair of the G20 just recently. They started talking to us a year out, saying, "How can you help us be successful in our role managing the G20 and hosting it in our country? What do we need to do to be successful in the world's eyes as the leader of the G20 for this next year?" And we put in lots of time, invested a lot in making India look good, because that strengthens us as their partner and as another democracy.
One of the questions that one of the board members asked, I think, may get into that. And you've touched a bit on it, Tim, before we go on to the questions from our audience. To what extent does India's rise challenge the traditional dominance of Western-led institutions like IMF and the World Bank? You touched a bit on it, but India both still is a recipient. I think we're still sending Peace Corps volunteers to India because of the poverty issues. I believe we are. And yet, on the other hand, they're very modern, and they're a major trading partner and a major player economically. So and yet these are Western-led large institutions, World Bank, IMF, and
So
they have disparities.
it's a fascinating area,
Yeah.
because India is pushing the United States very hard to reform these institutions that were created after World War II. They were created after 1945, when Europe needed to rebuild and the Marshall Plan came in. The developed countries many of them were demolished. And
Yeah.
so they needed to rebuild for the world economy to recover. What kinds of institutions needed to be built and funded? Banks, loaning institutions, um, political and economic organizations that could help the United States rebuild Japan and Europe and the world, so the economy functioned for everybody. These institutions now are 80, 90 years old, and they work for developed countries. Back in those days, they don't work so well for developing countries, and the way they lend, the interest rates they charge, the challenges they equip their employees to take on, their expertise. So India is pushing hard, and we have begun to support some of these efforts to say to these antiquated institutions, you need to change, or we need to develop some new institutions that can respond to the challenges in the world today. I mentioned some of the transnational challenges that we face earlier in the program. And I'll end on that as we get ready to go into the question and answer period. As a member of the Intelligence Committee, we often had this brief and this briefing. It was both classified and unclassified, and it was called Global Challenges 2035. And it would project 10 years ahead of time. What are the biggest global challenges in the world? How will they impact the world? And what are 2 or 3 likely scenarios to happen to the world as a result of these challenges? So we had a classified version of it, but there was an unclassified version that is published, and it's still published and it's available on the internet. You can get access to it. And they would outline, so here are the top 10 challenges. And the top 3 might be terrorism, it might be weapons of mass destruction, and it might be extreme weather, climate change. Maybe those were 3 of the transnational challenges. And so, how do the different countries address those challenges? How do they fund those challenges? How do they make progress on those challenges? And how do they position their military, their economic, their soft power to engage in ways where you can actually see progress in the next couple years on doing something different? It goes back, Betty, to the question of what's happening around the world politically. We're seeing populism, nationalism, center-right governments come into power in democracies. These institutions that were created for a lot of the right reasons around the world and everywhere in democracies are not functioning quite as well to deliver the challenges, results for the challenges that we live in this rapidly changing world with AI, with cyber, with bird flu and things that can hit us in days, not just weeks, and cripple our economy. I can't tell you how closely we came after 9/11 to our economy completely collapsing. Many of you on this call are old enough to remember precisely where you were on 9/11. I served in Congress. I was on the Intelligence Committee. I was on the Capitol Hill when a plane was supposed to be coming to the White House or the Capitol to kill people there. Our stock market came very, very close to going under. And so how do we try to make
When
sure
you
that
say go under, what do you mean by what would go under mean?
we
So,
shut the stock market down, Betty? We did not allow trading for several days because there was such panic in America after those attacks. I would go, I'm born and raised in South Bend. My constituency was Mishawaka and LaPorte and Elkhart. I would go into small cities around northern Indiana right after the attacks. People would not go to the movies. They would not go to the local commerce. They would not go shopping. They said, I don't want to get killed by the next terrorist attack. I'm terrified of what's going to happen next. That's what terrorists try to do, is they try to terrorize everybody into immobilization and, not just hurting you politically, but actually killing you economically. That's what terrorism tries to do. And they came very close. When people in the Midwest didn't want to spend money, didn't want to go out to the shopping or the movies, didn't want to, help their local neighbors in the donut store or the lunch market or whatever. We were in serious trouble for several days after those 9/11 attacks.
Before we transition to Ray, by the lending practices, I think Jeffrey Sachs also talks about this. Would this be where, if you're going to particularly very poor countries, you can't have the same lending practice of interest rates and conditions of return of the loan for a country that's very poor? I think Jeffrey Sachs has said you have to extend this out much longer at a much lower interest rate, or you're going to continue to keep the poor countries just in a cycle of continual poverty. Is this what you're
And it's
referring
not,
to?
it's not only the interest rates and the length of the loan, it's the type of loans that these institutions are willing to give.
Such as?
Well, if it's a developed country and the U.S. Wants, or a major country in the world wants a loan, not particularly the U.S., but a U.S.-like country wants to build a particular AI plant to grow the artificial intelligence capability that we're seeing these AI centers pop up all around America. Yeah, the developing countries are interested in AI and some of the potential benefits of AI, but they got to build a electricity plant. They've got to build a smelter plant. They've got to build plants that we were building 100 years ago and 80 years ago. And the expertise on those loans, the money designated to go to some of those things that developing countries need for economic development are not as accessible and easy as they were for us when those institutions helped us rebuild Japan and Europe and fund the Marshall Plan.
Okay, thank you. I think at this point, Ray, do we have questions from the audience?
Yes, we do. Thank you very much, Betty. And Tim, thank you for that great presentation. So those of you in the audience, if you do have a question, you can send it to me and I will call on you in the order in which you've kind of posted your question. And so we already have several in our queue. So we can start with Vengala Ram. I think you have a question.
Mr. Ambassador, I hope you can hear me. And first of all, thank you very kindly for your great service as ambassador to India. And thank you for sharing your expertise with us this evening.
Thank
I have
you.
a very simple question. I'm afraid my camera's on the fritz and I have COVID, so not feeling the best. But let me just ask you very, very simply. Bangladesh has just recognized Pakistan, and I'm wondering how you think this may affect the India-Bangladesh relationship going forward. Thank you, sir.
Sure. Well, feel better, Ram, and thanks for joining us, even with COVID. I'm not sure I would do that. I'd probably be in bed watching a movie. Very good question. Let's put this in terms of the India-Pakistan relationship, because that's kind of how you phrase the question. How does it impact India with this recognition of Pakistan? When I first arrived in New Delhi in 2009, I would do a press conference, could be anywhere in the country. It could be Kolkata or Chennai or somewhere in Rajasthan, could be at the embassy in New Delhi. And I would always get, no matter what topic I talked about, I would always get the first 7 or 8 questions would be on Pakistan. What's the U.S. going to do about Pakistan defense? What's the U.S. going to do about Pakistan and Afghanistan? What's the U.S. going to... Slowly over the last decade, that has really changed. India is still concerned about Pakistan for very obvious reasons. But, India does not see Pakistan as the existential threat that it did see it previously. In fact, India's economy is in great shape, growing, as I mentioned, at 6.5%. Pakistan is in serious economic problems. They're threatening to default on loans from the IMF. They have terrorism problems internally. They have instability in their government. They are not able to move through an entire cycle of an elected prime minister before somebody gets toppled or kicked out. And I think India has now moved to the recognition that Pakistan's never going to overtake us. The threat is Pakistan falling apart on our border. What would that mean to our security? So, it'll be interesting to see how Mr. Modi, his external affairs minister, who I have great respect for, Dr. Jaishankar, his national security advisor, Ajit Doval, how do they respond to this recognition? As you know, Ram, Pakistan is now very, very concerned about terrorism coming over the border from Afghanistan into their country and further destabilizing Pakistan. Bangladesh has just gone through its own volatility and instability, and the former leader, Sheikh Hasina, is now living in India, and they're going through a very rough time trying to stabilize the government and show, their political stability and economic stability. So we will see how this impacts, this recognition effort impacts the India relationship, whether it be the India relationship with Pakistan or with Bangladesh. But I have seen India's growing confidence and exertion of their foreign policy in the near neighborhood region. And 10, 15 years ago, you might see a very severe reaction from India. I think it's going to be measured. I think it's going to be, Modi and Jaishankar probably issuing a statement, doing some things to show their concern, but not nearly on the level that they would have shown their insecurity, a decade ago.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Really appreciate that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Feel better, Ram.
All right. Thank you. Claire Collins has a question, kind of historical reference to this question. So, Claire?
Yes. I got this idea from a Great Decisions book we had about 5 years ago, and it mentioned the Bhopal gas leak in December of 1984, and I'm old enough to remember that when that happened. But anyway, to refresh everybody's memory, 15,000 died. There was a leak at a Union Carbide plant, and more than 500,000 were injured. Union Carbide gave them $470 million, which in today's money is like 1.1 billion. So there were negotiations over many years, and the Indians aren't still satisfied with the $470 million. But during the George W. Bush administration, they were trying to get a deal with the Indians. The U.S. was trying to get a deal with the Indians on building nuclear power plants, and the Indian Congress would not go along with it without some assurance that the U.S. would pay them fairly if there was an accident. And to complicate the matters, in 2010, when the Deepwater Horizon oil spill happened in the Gulf of Mexico, then President Obama put pressure on British Petroleum to fork over $20 billion. And so I was just wondering, for one thing, has the toxic site near Bhopal been cleaned yet? And how does the memory of Bhopal affect further economic treaties and trade? And whose responsibility does this fall to, business or government?
Terrific question, Claire. And you mentioned Bhopal happened in 1984. I was in India in 2009, 2010, 2011, and Bhopal came up in our negotiations with the Indians. We had a very high level delegation come in to follow on the president's visit to try to wrap up some economic agreements, probably billions of dollars in two-way trade between the United States and India. And one of the people in the delegation was the current CEO, not the former CEO of Union Carbide when Bhopal happened, but the current CEO. And the Indians that brought up this whole memory of Bhopal to them, and they came very close to, to being able to scuttle the entire deal in 2010 that we were actively working on, because they wanted to revisit in real time the Bhopal settlement. Now, when we look at real dollars, there in my mind, there are several, pots of money that back when the settlement was arranged should have been fully, adequately funded. One is the compensation to victims. One is the cleanup and settlement. And one pot is what are the ongoing costs here to that area that, it's not Chernobyl like, but it certainly has, huge, huge consequences for the environment around there. So it's a very sensitive issue, Claire. It still to this day for the Indian people, and it hasn't popped up to the degree that it did back in 2009, 2010. But it continues to show that international companies, whether they be American, whether they be Chinese, whether they be Russian, or whether they be French, when you have a disaster like that happen that has devastating consequences on the people in that country, there is a moral and political and ethical obligation to make things right. And I don't know to this day that things were made right for the people of Bhopal.
Well, thank you. That's an interesting. I remember that situation myself, and that was
Very sad.
yeah. Our next question is from Eric Mishler. Eric?
Yes, Ambassador. I've read through the years with regard to economic growth in India, how stifling their regulations and bureaucratic red tape have been with regard to their job creation. Do you have a sense of how well Modi may have addressed this problem in recent years?
Yes, very timely question, Eric. I thank you for it. So one of the innovative things Modi has done is, I said earlier that, we have 50 states here. We have competition between our states and our governors on different programs. We have lessons learned in our governments. Thomas Jefferson used to always talk about in our system, the states are laboratories of democracy, percolating with new ideas and opportunities for citizens and people and new experiments on economic growth and education and so forth. Very similar in India. They have 30 states. And Modi came into office back in 2014, and he said, I'm not only going to try to break, regulation and corruption at the national level, I'm going to go after it at the state level. I'm going to measure corruption and ease of doing business, put metrics together for all 30 states, and I'm going to keep track of one state versus the other, and we're going to rank them in an order of 30, friendliest to business being number 1, and most regulatory and unfriendly being number 30. And it lit the fuse of the states competing against each other, particularly in those states that Modi controlled, that were BJP chief minister run states. And you saw an impetus to, address corruption, remove regulation, reform tax codes, to make it easier for foreign investment to come in, and for this ease of doing business scale to be shared across the country. And he still, to this day, Prime Minister Modi still does that. And, it's probably in India, it's to the Indian people, as I travel there, I still get there twice a year. They generally see that as a very positive thing that has increased economic growth in India, provided more jobs for more people, They hate corruption. They're trying to, get rid of the corruption at the local and the state and the national level. So, Modi has been he's been fairly innovative at trying to find ways to get around the very kernel of the question that you asked in your first sentence.
Very interesting. Thank you, Ambassador.
Sure thing.
All right. Thank you, Eric. That was a good question. Next, I think Trevor Williams has a question.
Ambassador, thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
My question has to do with BRICS. Do you think that the U.S. is pushing more countries towards BRICS with its recent economic threats? President Trump recently threatened 100% tariffs on all BRICS nations if they moved away from the U.S. dollar. Do you think that this aggressive stance could accelerate the BRICS bloc's expansion and weaken the U.S. influence?
Well, you ask a terribly important question about tariffs in general, Trevor. And, you can go back to look at tariffs at the turn of the previous century. McKinley, Grover Cleveland, both a Democrat and a Republican, looked at tariffs as a means to try to equal the playing field with trade internationally, as a means to raise revenue for our to fund our programs, because the progressive tax had not come in yet under Theodore Roosevelt. That was to come in 10 or 15 years. So the tariff served, many purposes back then, 120, 25 years ago. I think today, especially with the economy that the United States faces, inflation is a big issue still. It was under President Biden's administration. It is today. We're seeing the price of eggs go up at Denny's and Waffle House and Costco, and they've quadrupled in the last 2 or 3 months. We've seen young people struggling with their rent and housing prices, and that's due to new construction. We can't get new construction going for middle-class people in this country. The affordability of the American dream is evaporating to some degree for hardworking Americans. And so this inflation issue is a tinderbox. And when you put tariffs on products, as you know, Trevor, the tariff, let's say the United States puts a tariff on Indian steel coming into the United States. The Indian company putting the steel in the United States doesn't pay that tariff. The U.S. importer pays that tariff. So when that importer pays the tariff to bring that that Indian product into the U.S. market, they absorb the cost of the increased tariff that Trump has put on it. And they have two choices. That business can absorb the cost of that tariff, or they pass it on to us as consumers. And what we found when we looked at tariffs that Trump put on in 2018 and 19, shoes, purses, washing machines, almost across the board, those tariffs were passed on to the American consumer. Washing machine prices went up by several $100s. And so that cost us more. So you have to be extremely careful about slapping universal tariffs across the board. If that reignites inflation in our country, we're going to be in serious trouble. And Trump is going to be in, I think, serious trouble in the midterm elections. So what I was advocating earlier, Trevor, is targeted, leveraged, strategic tariffs that you might apply on India in a particular negotiation, in a particular sector of a product. Let's say we slap, we have tariffs on India on steel and aluminum to protect our industry and our jobs. That makes some sense. And because they're already there, maybe we increase them unless India lets our Indiana soybeans or dairy farm products into their markets. and we sell our product there, we help our Indiana farmer and our Indiana middle class worker do better, then we take the tariff down or take it away. Those kinds of strategically targeted tariffs in a negotiation can help our middle class families and our trade situation potentially do better. But if you slap tariffs across the board, China, India, Mexico, Canada, Great Britain, France, you are really playing with the danger of lighting the fuse on inflation. And in inflation, if it gets up to 5, 6, 7, 8%, I think President Trump could be in some real trouble.
Ambassador, so what do you think about the BRICS bloc expanding if they feel that they're getting bullied by the United States?
Well, I can speak to the Biden administration, Trevor. The Biden administration was pretty strategic, pretty clever, and pretty savvy about this. They would go to other potential partners, BRICS, partners, and say to them, we don't want you to choose between the US and India, because no country wants to be put in that position. Peru, Mexico, particularly Southeast Asian countries that trade significantly with China, don't want to be seen as anti-China. They can be seen as pro-US, but they don't want to be seen when 50% of their economy is dependent on Chinese trade. They don't want to be in a bloc that's anti-China. So the US under Biden was going to Singapore and the Philippines and Indonesia and other countries that belong to the BRIC and saying, hey, we've got a great new idea. We want to partner with you guys on building undersea cables that will connect more of your poor people and your middle class people to the internet. And we can fund so much of it. Here's what we're going to do together. Here's the interest payments. And, you don't have as big of an obligation as you would under the World Bank or the IMF. And make it something that entices those BRIC countries to partner on those particular issues with the United States, and not make it an either or with the US or China. When, as you mentioned, if Mr. Trump is going to be out there saying things that, I'm going to slap tariffs on everybody, and everybody feels like they have to, when you get a tariff slapped on you, you kind of feel like you have to, do something. You got to respond to that. We don't want China to develop, more friends, soft power and hard power, as a result of the United States losing influence with the BRIC country nations. And that's China's in a position where they are very smart about seeing where US strategic weaknesses are and moving into those markets and those areas, exploiting those weaknesses and trying to develop economic trade relations with countries when we make a mistake, as you've pointed out.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Trevor. It's kind of a follow-up for that. Larry Cimino, I think, has a question that kind of addresses this issue of soft power that you kind of mentioned.
Yeah, thanks.
Go ahead, Larry.
And thank you, Ambassador, for joining us. We're lucky to have someone like you joining us.
Wow, where are you? That's is that your library or is that a bookstore?
Yeah, I wish it were real.
Oh my gosh, that looks like I'd like to spend a weekend in there.
Right. Well, we're lucky to have someone like you who went to India and spent as much time and energy as obviously you did to understand what their issues were, and then to understand what we would like to negotiate with them about what our issues are. Obviously, you want to talk to them about human rights and freedoms of the press and democracy and free trade and so forth. But what I wanted to ask you about this evening, really, is you mentioned that you would align all of the agencies of the of the U.S. in moving towards the priorities that we wanted. I wanted to ask a little bit about USAID, what their priorities were, perhaps are, but were in India, And what's happened to those things now? And what do you think is going to happen if we just drop the ball on all the activities that we were engaged in? And that's where I think Ray was talking about the soft power. If we abandon our soft power, there were certainly other people, particularly even in their neighborhood of India, who would certainly like to jump right in and grab that soft power without the negotiations that we're so interested in. There are no strings attached sometimes to that, or certainly no guardrails of what the way they would operate in those countries without focusing on human rights, free trade, and the kinds of issues which we try to foster, and democracy in countries now. So
great question. I don't know if you remember the name General Jim Mattis. He was Mr. Trump's defense secretary in his first term. And General Mattis, was testifying on Capitol Hill. I think it was about 2016. Maybe it was in his confirmation hearing. Maybe it was after. And he was asked the question, what do you think of the State Department budget on soft power? Shouldn't we cut that? And Mattis was very direct, very, very, pointed in his reply. He said, you can do that if you want, but for every dollar you cut out of soft power, I got to add $1 or $2 to make up for that in hard power in the Defense Department. So yeah, shift it over to me if you want, but it is not going to help us save money. And in fact, you will probably enable and empower our enemies around the world to fill the vacuum. I can't tell you the number of times in India when I would be in my car and there was an American flag on that car, and we would roll up in a village that was probably a 2-hour plane ride, 3-hour car ride from New Delhi. And we'd be delivering, some U.S. assistance to flood victims or disaster relief or food aid. And that American flag pulled up in that village. No U.S. ambassador had ever been in that village before. No Chinese ambassador had ever been there. No Russian ambassador had ever been there. And I guarantee you, Larry, that no one will forget that day that lives in that village for the rest of their life. That America came there to rescue them in their need. And when the United States needs something from India and we need to partner with them on something, or, there's some question in their parliament about who do you side with, the US or China, those people are going to be for America because we were there for them. And I just can't tell you how short-sighted it is for us to be demolishing the USAID department. It was one of my larger departments in my mission in New Delhi. They did extraordinarily good work. We had a huge number of lawyers and accountants that went through their books looking for corruption or aid that was going to the wrong people. So we had the accountability built into the system to try to completely mitigate, if not eliminate, money going into the wrong areas. Look, when I would go home to Indiana and be in a town meeting, yeah, people want to cut out, corruption out of our government. They want to make sure there's no fat and waste and fraud. I raise my hand. I'm with them on that. There are programs that shouldn't be in our government, but the USAID program, where we account for 98% of the money, that makes middle-class Americans safer in a dangerous world today. And we've got to be able to tell that story. We've got to be able to say and use concise, precise examples of, hey, we're not opposing efforts to make government streamlined and more accountable, but should Elon Musk, the richest guy in the world, who's never been elected to anything, who gets $38 billion of government money, who started Tesla on government money, who gets money from the taxpayer through SpaceX, is he the guy that should be objectively and fairly going through these budgets and deciding who wins and who loses? No, that's Congress's role. That's why we send those people there to oversee it. That's why our Constitution says Article 1, Section 1 of our Constitution demands that Congress have the oversight role of those things. And they should be doing their job. Congress should be looking at these things and sifting through them and trying to find out, what's going on. And if there's not fraud, defend the program. If there is fraud, get rid of it. But don't let Elon Musk determine, he's not the fair umpire, the referee that should be determining, what gets cut and what doesn't.
And to allege that USAID is a criminal organization is pretty appalling to the thousands of Americans that have dedicated their lives in those areas.
Oh, and a guy who's worth $200 billion to be cutting, dollars and pennies from aid programs that help the starving people in Sudan. You couldn't put together a more George Orwellian example of injustice.
But what were the major programs USAID was involved in or is involved in India?
We were across the board, Larry. We did everything in India from, food assistance programs, not giving them food, but continuing in the tradition that we started in the 1960s when we sent over an Iowa professor who helped them grow hybrid wheat and corn that was resistant to the fungi that had wiped out their food product and made them reliant on importing foodstuffs, gave them the ability. Our expertise went over to India to allow them not only to protect their own foodstuff and feed themselves, they now export food out of India because the United States of America shared our professors, our science, our technology with India, and buffered them from further famine. Those are the kind of programs when we do research together. We do everything from water. How do we harvest and protect water better? We have education programs through USAID to help women who grow up in the lowest caste system. They are part of the untouchables, to learn new skills so that they can actually move up and maybe move into other kinds of roles in society. It's just across the board in economic development, and the good it does, the trust and confidence it builds between the U.S. and India is immeasurable.
Thank you.
All right. Before I turn it back to Betty, I have one question I'd like to ask you. And this is more of maybe a personal question for a lot of people. Is the Indian government doing anything to kind of mitigate these scam farms that exist in, like Bangalore and so forth?
I think they probably are pushed. We've talked to the past U.S. Ambassador Eric Garcetti, the former mayor of Los Angeles, about some of this. He pushes into the Indian government to tell them, you can't allow this to happen. Your call centers are one thing. The scam centers ripping off seniors and other people. You got to find them. You got to root out the corruption. You got to shut them down. It's not their highest priority, Ray, when they got so many other priorities in that country, from starvation and hunger to, national security issues and threats from China and Pakistan and terrorism. They've recently cut their diplomacy budget by several tens of millions of dollars, what they invest in soft power and what they invest in training their foreign diplomats. So, they're facing some tough issues. They shut down a scam center, and that's, 200 people that are now unemployed. So they have to weigh the benefits of ticking off the United States with the jobs in their local market, and we push hard on it and try to get them to act more on it. And sometimes they're very reluctant to do it, to be truthful with you.
Well, it's really, I hate to say it's just an annoyance in the United States, but real people get hurt a lot by some of these things. So.
And you're absolutely right on that front. There are scam centers. Now we're seeing more and more AI generated scams that come in and are more sophisticated to fool people out of life savings and investments in mutual funds, and phishing accounts on your email through cybersecurity. Threats to people. Hey, I have your granddaughter and I'll release her for $5,000. And they have the voice of your granddaughter that they can play through algorithms and picking it up on the internet. This is scary stuff, not just coming from scam centers, but, people in the US, people in Russia, people in China are devoting full time to these kinds of phishing expeditions and scams and financial disasters for a lot of vulnerable people.
Well, thank you very much. And just thank you overall for the great presentation tonight. And with that, I'll turn it back to Betty and she'll take us home.
Yes, this has been great. We left a couple of things on the table. I don't know whether you want to, we had talked earlier about, you had mentioned supply chain resiliency, the question of can India emerge realistically as an alternative to China for global manufacturing, and also with Russia. Is there any final thoughts you want to make on that? Or
only let me put it in the broad perspective, because I know a lot of your viewers now are probably, geez, I've had enough of Roemer. I got to go to the refrigerator and get something. I got to get a beer and get away from this foreign policy stuff for a little while. Stream my favorite movie. What's so fascinating to me, and I won't get going on it because this is one of my most interesting topics these days, Betty. I'm really trying to understand it more. So post-COVID, during and pre-COVID, let's start there. During COVID, pre-COVID, the United States determined through a lot of our businesses, our pharmaceuticals, our access to medicine, but also some of our US companies had become too dependent on China, meaning we had business in China and 90% of the business was in China. So 90% of the drug that would help us, somehow address COVID, let's just use a hypothetical example, was coming from China, and COVID shut half of that down. And we found a lot of our other companies, chip producing companies, defense companies, auto companies were too reliant on their supply chains. We call it in the business world resiliency. They were not resilient. Instead of having something in the US, something in China, maybe something in Vietnam or India, diversity, like we're always told in our investments, diversify your investments, have some cash, have stocks, have bonds. Too many countries were solely dependent on China. COVID hits. We can't get access to so many different things because that one supply chain is shut down. So post-COVID, all the companies now are searching for supply chain resilience. Do we homeshore some of these products that we shipped over to China, make them at home in the US of A? We can get access to it. It might be more expensive to make it at home with labor costs, but we won't ever be shut down from it, trying to come overseas with shipments being shut off and ports being closed and everything due to a pandemic. India and Vietnam, as you can imagine, want to get into the game because they think, well, we can make in India. Well, that's what Modi wants us to do. Let's try to convince these US companies and European companies that we're too overly invested in China with one supply chain coming out of there. Let's talk them into building a manufacturing company in our country, in India or Vietnam or Malaysia. And it can be less labor, it can be cheaper costs, it's still got to be exported somewhere. So there's this massive undertaking now, Betty, going on throughout the world in the business communities. How do we diversify supply chains? How do we become more resilient in these supply chains? And how do we compete with a product? Where do we build these supply chains? Many of us are trying to encourage the businesses, locate them in America. We've got the best labor there. We've got the best education system in the world there. We've got, the best infrastructure in the world in America. Let's homeshore some of these supply chains where we, like a supply chain, for instance, for computer chips and AI. Those are national security chips. Those are highly sensitive. Your speaker next week will get into this. We don't want NVIDIA and Intel and other manufacturers manufacturing this or giving this to China as a enhanced capability. These chips, Betty, are going into refrigerators and fighter jets. They're going into aircraft carriers and cars. They're going into drones, unmanned drones, and they're going into kids' toys. But on the national security side, if China ever cut us off from these chips, or if Taiwan was ever attacked, where 48% of the chips are made today, the sophisticated chips, we're in deep trouble in America. We don't get access if Taiwan's quarantined and China surrounds them. Our access to those chips are cut off. So this supply chain, resiliency, diversity, home shoring, diverse shoring, it is a huge conversation going on in the world today, in the political world and in the business world. And it's something that the United States has to think very carefully about and get right.
And another program.
Exactly. And you can get into some of this in the AI program. Hopefully he'll talk about some of this. There's so much to talk about in AI.
Well, the moderator for the AI program, another board member, Dan Foote, is with us this evening, and he's probably taking notes on that very thing. We may see some questions. Tim, you need to join us next week, please, if you can.
I'm fascinated by it.
Well, we'll send you a link. We'll just send you a
Please
link.
do. Please do.
You want to charge you the $10 we would normally charge a non-member
I
of the
can eat
ICWA?
popcorn and put my slippers on and watch. Do I have to turn my camera on?
Yeah, you do, because if
Okay.
you're going to have popcorn and have a glass of wine, we just, that's okay.
All right.
Perfectly all right. This has been great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Larry, thank you for bringing up about soft power. I thought, my gosh, we should have talked about that also in the moderated. This is so critical that we actually had a meeting the other day among just a few of the board members, because we had somebody in from WACA, our nation organization, and we actually talked about maybe we should have a program on soft power next year. And it'll give us a few months to see what happens with this new administration and with threat of tariffs and all kinds of things. Where is soft power going? Is USAID really gone? And what will happen? And by next year, we'll have a few months. We have on our board somebody who's just come back as the chief of staff for a major project in Pakistan. Tim, that might be something that you might also, maybe that'd be a panel discussion. It can be really interesting, folks, to have a discussion. The importance of soft power to national security. It is like it's hand in glove. You can't separate the two. Soft power has more of an impact on diplomacy than bullets. So it might be a really good program. I'll stay in touch with you on that. This is fabulous. Thank you very, very much for giving us your time this evening. Appreciate it very much. I'm going to maybe write a special note to Lee Hamilton, who is also a member of Congress for Indiana, and say, thank you for recommending Tim Roemer and give me a chance.
One of my great friends in life is Lee Hamilton. I still call him every couple months and we talk, and I got to get out to Bloomington and have lunch with him.
Yeah, we have had some amazing, amazing people in the House and the Senate, have we not, from Indiana?
Great
Absolutely amazing, including you. And so we have a lot to be proud about as Hoosiers. And I'm going to say thank you all for coming this evening. It's been a wonderful program. Thank you for your participation. We appreciate it very much. Please still consider being a member. We could use that type of support. It would mean an awful lot to us. Just your attendance means a lot to us. And we will see you next week for another program. We have 4 more weeks of great decisions. Again, just another reminder that April and May will be in-person programs as part of our global speaker series, Music as a Global Language, which will feature international musicians who are here in Central Indiana. It'll be an engagement with the audience. It'll be a discussion of what are the stories that they are telling us, and just a lot of engagement with the audience. It's going to be a lot of fun. Offer a global cuisine with wine, or you can come just for the program for free and buy a glass of wine, walk around, see the beautiful global village that Mary Clark has started with the museum. Just a great fun evening. A very unique program. We've never done something like this, and we just thought it was time. And then the very last program of the year will be Indianapolis as a global city. Tim, I don't know how old you are, maybe a little bit younger than me, but we can remember Indianapolis as nap town. And it's a little bit of a sleepy town, and no one would call it that anymore. It's very
No
exciting.
way. Great sports town, great college town, great restaurants. It's a
It's a
wonderful
global
place.
city. It's a lot of things going on. So please, but for now, come back and join us next week. But we do encourage you to, you will have to sign up for the programs in April and May. And of course, you have to sign up for next week for a link. So thank you again this evening.